Welcome to Brookings and the Hutchins Center on Fiscal and Monetary Policy. I'm impressed to see that all of you have braved what passes for a blizzard in Washington. I want to assure you we have plenty of facilities here. If you get trapped because we have 1.5 inches of snow, we can take care of you for a few hours. I'm very pleased today to be helping celebrate Kim Clausing's new book, Open, The Progressive Case for Free Trade, Immigration, and Global Capital. The timing couldn't be better. We are, I think, since even before the last presidential election, engaged in a huge debate about whether globalization, immigration, free trade, flows of global capital are, A, responsible for everything good that's happened to the U.S. economy over the last couple of decades, or B, responsible for everything bad that's happened over the last couple of decades. As you know, the world is never black and white. As a journalist, I always said that our job was to make the shades of gray a little darker and a little lighter so that people could understand what was going on, and we're going to try and do that today. The order of business is Kim Clausing is going to make a presentation. Kim is a professor of economics at Reed College, where she specializes in international trade, international finance, and particularly taxation of multinational firms. Then I'm going to be joined up here by a panel of 3 people with very different perspectives, so I'll introduce later. So Kim, when can I call on you? And welcome to Brookings.
Thank you so much, David. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be at Brookings to talk about my book. I am also really grateful for the panel you put together, which looks awesome. I'd like to start with a few words about why I wrote this book. And for me, the starting point was really the 2016 election. And the rhetoric of that election on both the left and the right made 2 things very clear to me. One, the economic dissatisfaction was very deep. People were upset with the rising inequality over the prior decades, with the wage stagnation, with declining opportunity. And even though the last 8 years had seen improvement in economic well-being, there was still a lot of economic discontent. But the second theme of that election was a swelling tide of nationalism. And this was seen in the rhetoric of candidates on both ends of the political spectrum. Foreigners and trade agreements like NAFTA were held up as responsible for the weakening status of the middle class. Now, the outcome of that election, as we all know, was a result of many different factors. But on Inauguration Day, the one promise that Trump made the American people was to put America first. And this theme was frequently appealed to in the years since in terms of economic policy. And I would point out that the United States is not alone in this appeal to economic nationalism. Brexit reflected a tide of nationalism and a rejection of EU trade and migration policies. We've seen nationalism on the rise in Poland and Hungary, in Brazil's recent election, and elsewhere. So this book is one economist's 3-pronged response to that rising tide of nationalism. The first question asked is, what's going on with the American middle class? Why is it that we see wages stagnant despite increases in GDP? What's caused the increase in income inequality over the last few decades? And how much should we blame the global economy for that? The second big question is, what are the consequences of openness for American workers? And by openness, I look at it in a lot of different ways. I look at trade, capital mobility, multinational corporations, and immigration. And I ask, how do these factors affect U.S. workers? But also importantly, what if we were to curtail those factors or to limit them? How would that affect U.S. workers? And the final question is what to do about all of this. And in the closing chapters of the book, I suggest a policy agenda to respond to these recent decades of economic outcomes. So today I only have 20 minutes, so I'm going to give you a brief taste of these arguments, but hopefully this and the conversation that we have afterwards will inspire you to engage with the longer arguments in the book, which, by the way, is for sale in the back a full month before you can get it on Amazon. Okay, so let's start with what's happening with the American middle class. And you see in this picture here, the blue line is showing you the increase in GDP per capita over the last few decades. And that's been very substantial. There's been an over 60% increase in GDP per person in the United States over the last 3 decades, enough so that if distributed equally, everyone could have more than $20,000 of additional real income over these previous decades. But notice the red line is far flatter. What the red line is showing you is median household income. So at a time when GDP per capita has been rising strongly in real terms, real median household income is much flatter, and in fact, less than a quarter of the growth that you see in GDP per capita. And that's, of course, problematic for your typical household. Why has that occurred? In short, income inequality. And if you look at these two eras of income inequality, you see a very different pattern. So in the first 35 years after World War II, cumulative income growth for the bottom 90% of the population was about 100%. So they expected their incomes to double. They roughly doubled over that 35-year period. Whereas income growth at the top, the other 3 bars of the top 10%, the top 1%, and the top 1/10 of 1%, that income growth was actually smaller than that of the bottom 90%. So that was an era when rising tides lifted all boats. But this most recent era, the most previous, the 35 years just previous, have a very different pattern, right? The bottom 50% of the population sees almost no economic cumulative income growth. The 50th to 90th percentile see less than half what they did in the earlier period. And the growth is really spectacular only for those at the top 10%, the top 1%, and even better, the top 1/10%. So if you look at that period, that shows us that there really is a good reason for economic discontent. The economic growth isn't necessarily helping everybody, right? And so there's a lot to worry about here. So the next question is, why is this happening, right? So one thing you could say is, okay, well, in the second period, there was definitely more trade, there was more immigration, there was more foreign direct investment. Maybe foreigners are the problem, and that's one possibility. But one thing to keep in mind is that a lot else changes between these two periods that might contribute as well. One example would be technological change, right? The role of computers, mechanization, the internet have displaced the need for a lot of unskilled labor and probably shifted demand away from those workers and towards others in the economy. And so technological change is an important issue. But there are several other important things that have changed too. Market power is a much more salient feature of today's economy than it was earlier. We see sales and profits are much more concentrated in a few companies than they used to be, and a larger share of society's savings is in the hands of corporations. We see changes in labor markets, where there's less unionization and a richer reward for those at the very top of most labor markets. We see changes in social norms. Now the typical CEO earns 300 times the average worker's salary. In 1980, that was 30 times. So there's a big change in executive compensation. And there have also been huge changes in economic policy, including reductions in top tax rates and reductions in capital taxes. And all these other factors are important. If you look at the economies in the world, almost all of them have experienced increasing globalization and increasing technological change. Yet the outcomes on the ground look pretty different in different places. And one of the reasons for that is that institutions, social norms, and policy matter. So at the end, there's a lot going on, and people are definitely right to be concerned. Globalization may be a factor, but it's not clear it's the only factor. This storm that's affecting the middle class is coming from a lot of different directions. Okay. So next, let's think very briefly about 2 types of economic integration and how they can explain or not explain what we've seen going on with American workers. And today I'm going to focus on trade and immigration, but leave capital mobility and multinational corporations for later in the conversation. So international trade comes with a lot of benefits that I talk about in chapters 3 and 5 of the book, but it also comes with costs and downsides. And one example, it comes from the China shock. A team of researchers has shown, using variation in exposure to Chinese imports, which you see the more exposure you have, the darker in this map, that extra Chinese imports due to China's joining the world economy probably reduced U.S. manufacturing employment by about 1 to 2 million jobs. And that's a serious cost, a cost that's spread over several years when those imports were coming in. But keep in mind that while that sounds bad, we should probably put it in a larger perspective. For one thing, those Chinese imports, some of them were intermediate goods, right? And those intermediate goods might have actually enhanced the competitiveness of US firms and caused more job creation elsewhere in the economy. It's possible that that job loss also led to otherwise more expansionary monetary policy than we would have seen. But even ignoring those factors, another thing to keep in context is this job loss is 1 to 2 million jobs over a period of years. But this gives you the job loss per quarter for the US economy. And every single quarter, we lose typically over 6 million jobs in the US economy. Luckily, we also create typically over 6 million jobs every single quarter. But there's just a lot of disruption coming from all sorts of sources in the US economy on a regular basis, right? Over 6 million jobs a quarter are lost, over 6 million jobs a quarter are gained, right? So you can lose your job for a lot of reasons. You can lose it in part for foreign competition, but you can lose it because of domestic competition. You can lose it because a robot comes and takes your job. You can lose it just because consumers decide they like one thing more than another and shift demand away from your firm and towards another firm. So those are all causes of job loss and disruption. Now you could argue, well, losing your job to a foreigner is in a way more hurtful than losing it to a robot, and I suppose that's possible. You could also argue, well, we can't do anything about robots or social norms or market power, but what we can do is we can raise tariffs, right? And maybe that would help us undo this 1 to 2 million job loss, even if we can't address every 6 million that happen each quarter. So one question I ask in the book is, are tariffs ultimately helpful to American workers? And I conclude that no, actually, from a set of priorities where we prioritize American workers, tariffs are actually quite harmful to them in several ways. So what are those ways? First is producers, right? It's true we've had trade shocks. Those are hard to undo, but that doesn't mean that we need to create new trade shocks. And trade restrictions and barriers often create new shocks. For example, soybean farmers in the Midwest have felt the pain of our trade policy lately as they've sold fewer soybeans. General Motors has paid over $1 billion in tariffs over the last year, and they've also closed plants in the Midwest. Many U.S. companies have announced that they're making less profits than they expected to because of disruptions in their global supply chain. These are all new types of shocks that affect American workers and generate new types of disruption. So that's one way in which trade barriers affect workers. Another way is through their role as consumers. All of us are consumers as well as producers. And one underappreciated fact is that tariffs are very regressive taxes. So if you look at the share of income spent on imports for the bottom quintile, it's about 3 times the size of the share of income spent on imports for the top quintile. And so that means that when we tax trade, we're disproportionately putting that tax burden on those at the bottom of the distribution. And in fact, if you go back in history and you look at why we adopted the income tax over 100 years ago and pushed for it through the constitutional amendment that was necessary in order to allow that, there was a strong sense at the time in the early 1900s that after that first Gilded Age, we couldn't really rely on regressive tariffs to fund the state, that we needed to turn to a fairer tax, which is the income tax. And so that's an important piece of our history to keep in mind. A third way that trade restrictions hurt households is by hurting our international relations. And that's not nothing. We have a lot of global problems that affect households on a daily basis that require cooperation. And one that leaps to mind is climate change, of course. Now, I know it's out of vogue to care about other countries, but I would also point out that trade and global market access have been important for them. Trade is not the only thing going on in this diagram, but you see here that the fraction of the world's population that's living below the global poverty line, which is $1.90 a day, has declined dramatically in just this time period that we've been talking about since 1980. So it used to be 40% of the world lived below that very low extreme poverty line. Now it's about 8% if you go out to the present day, right? And the decline in China, you'll notice, is even steeper than the decline for the rest of the world. Now, openness isn't all of that story, but it's an important part of that story. And another important thing to keep in mind is that these gains are not a zero-sum situation. At the same time that those poor countries have grown and have passed that growth along to their citizens, the United States has also seen GDP per capita grow grow by 60% in those same years, right? So our economy is growing while their economy is growing. It's not true that our gains have been evenly shared, but that's a separate question from whether our growth is consistent with their growth, which it clearly is. And as Chapter 6 of the book explains, trade deficits are not a good metric for who's winning and losing and achieving the gains from trade, and it's a particularly silly policy tool for the United States. I'd be happy to talk about that later, but I don't want to go into that a lot now. Okay, so while trade has created some adjustment costs, the basic conclusion is that the trade barriers will do more harm to U.S. workers than help them, and indeed those barriers create a lot of costs for ourselves and others. Okay, I'd also like to talk a bit about immigration. This one is actually even easier. There are no serious evidence that immigration is responsible for the woes of American workers. In the economics literature, there have been hundreds of papers written on immigration, and the picture is pretty clear. Immigrants are good for the country. Immigration is good for almost all the groups in the country. It's good for the immigrants themselves, and there are very few losers to reckon with here. Now, immigrants are presently about 13% of the population, as you see here. This counts anyone that's residing in the U.S. that's foreign-born. The undocumented, by the way, are less than a quarter of that total and a shrinking part of that total. And most of those overstay their visas rather than crossing the border. Immigrants are not evenly spread out, but they tend to settle in particular communities. And notice this part of the country that doesn't have a lot of immigrants is also the part of the country that tends to object to them the most, which is an interesting polling finding. But some nonetheless feel that we have too much immigration, despite the lack of evidence that immigrants are harmful. And under the present U.S. administration, we have many policies that are hostile to immigrants, including not just the idea of the wall, but increased vetting and obstacles for legal immigration, as well as reduced refugee quotas. In the UK, of course, restricting migration was one of the points of Brexit, and we also see migration being a big issue throughout the EU. So I'd like to point out dangers for American workers of reducing immigration and what sort of risks are involved for US workers. One risk is that we lose talent and innovation. There's some fun facts in the book, but one fact is that over 60% of our scientific Nobel Prizes that are awarded in the world go to US-based researchers, but a minority of those go to US researchers who were born here. The majority is going to foreign-born US residents. So there's certainly, immigrants are very important for innovation. Over half of our graduate students in computer science and engineering are foreign students. Many of these want to stay and work in the United States. This is an area where we have a lot of skill shortages, but often we require these folks to go home. A second big cost of restricting migration is that we lose entrepreneurs and job creators. About 40% of our Fortune 500 companies were founded by immigrants or their children. Half of our billion-dollar startups were founded by immigrants. And so this is a big source of job creation that we would lose by restricting migration. A third loss is that we lose important parts of the labor force, right? We need the skilled workers for some unique talents that they have, but we also need unskilled workers who often do jobs that native-born Americans are reluctant to do, such as agricultural field work or elder care. And importantly, immigrants also ease our demographic burdens and budget burdens associated with Social Security and Medicare. We view these burdens as large, but imagine living in Japan where the ratio of retirees to workers is 8 to 10. So there are 8 retirees for every 10 workers in Japan. In Italy, there are 5 retirees for every 10 workers. In the United States and Canada, that number is a healthier 3. And the reason it's lower is because not only do we have our current generation of immigrants, but recent generations of immigrants have higher fertility rates than people who've been in the United States longer. So these are all important things to keep in mind before restricting migration. And finally, I would also argue there's an important moral argument for being open to refugees. As Emma Lazarus put it, these are the huddled masses yearning to be free, and closing our door to them seems to me at least to be un-American. I use that word purposefully. So in the end, I suggest more, not less, immigration for the good of American workers, targeting both unskilled and skilled workers. Okay, so to recap, this book is arguing that there's important problems facing American workers, but that erecting trade barriers and immigration restrictions and the like is more likely to hurt them than help them. But this leaves us with the big question, which is what to do. So what should we do about these decades of income inequality and wage stagnation? These are very important features of our world. So I suggest in the chapters at the end of the book several important policy things that we can do. I'll just give you a few examples of those here. One set is to support workers better, right? And we can support workers both by investing in things like infrastructure and education and research and development, but also by helping workers who've been left behind through things like wage insurance, free community college, strengthening the Affordable Care Act, and helping invest in communities that have really received these shocks. And that's an important part of the policy response. Another important step we can take is true tax reform. And I would distinguish true tax reform from what we saw the past year as the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act went into effect. I would argue that that legislation was a big step in the wrong direction. But I would build true tax reform around three principles. First, expanding the earned income tax credit and targeting negative tax rates to those at the bottom of the income distribution. Our tax system is strong enough to make sure that when GDP goes up, that those at the bottom can receive some of the gains from that. And that's something that we should be doing far more aggressively. Second, I suggest making the tax system more efficient by reducing the tax avoidance gaming. And we can do that by taxing different types of income more uniformly. For individuals, this means taxing capital income at a higher rate that's more commensurate with how we tax labor. For companies, this means taxing foreign income at a rate that's more commensurate with how we tax domestic income. And third, I suggest a carbon tax. That's long overdue, and I was thrilled to join a group of prominent economists from across a wide spectrum who support that ideal. Almost every time we tax, we discourage something good, like labor or savings or entrepreneurship. But if you tax carbon, you discourage something bad, and that's a beautiful thing. And carbon taxes need not be political suicide if we make a clear link between the revenue we get from those and lower tax rates elsewhere in the system, and perhaps carbon refunds or something like that. The final set of policy ideas that I bring up in the book are clustered around a better partnership with the business community. It's long recognized that markets work best when they're competitive and when people have access to information as consumers and workers and investors. And we can do a lot better to ensure a competitive marketplace and address issues of market power and to provide people with better information. And so I go through some of those ideas in the book. In general, these policy ideas are all based around the sort of economist love of finding efficient solutions to our social problems in the ever-present hope that by lowering the cost of addressing the problems, we make the problems easier to address. But unfortunately, I wrote this book because I believe we are in a dangerous time. The last big era of globalization ended with a rising tide of nationalism and was followed by 2 world wars and a Great Depression. At present, our economic discontent resulting from inequality and wage stagnation have created a situation where nationalism and isolationism is far more attractive than it should be. This is clearly dangerous for peace, but it's also dangerous for the prosperity of workers, which I argue in the book. But most important, I think, blaming foreigners for our economic problems really distracts us from effective and direct policy solutions to these very same problems. So I believe this moment in history is an important time to get economic policy right, and I'm looking forward to discussing how we might do that. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.